The smell of recycled air and scorched polymer was the first thing Declan Reyes noticed when he woke up on the ship. Not because it was unusual. Every hegemony transport smelled like that. A flat industrial nothing engineered to offend no alien respiratory system. But because it reminded him, with blunt and unwelcome precision, that he was no longer on Earth. He lay still for a moment on the bunk shelf and stared at the ceiling, which was low and gray and featureless. His hands were folded on his chest. He could feel his own heartbeat through his palms, steady, unhurried, a small mechanical fact about being alive. He counted 5 beats, then he sat up. The bunk bay held 43 other humans. He knew this because he had counted them twice before sleeping, the way his father had taught him to count the people in a room before committing to anything. His father had been a machinist from Guadalajara who'd never left the planet and had died convinced that the hegemony's arrival was either the best or worst thing to ever happen to the species, depending on the day you asked him. Declan still wasn't sure who had been right. He pulled on his boots, standard issue, the soles worn flat on the right heel from the way he walked, and moved down the row of bunks toward the narrow washroom at the far end. Several of the others were already awake. A woman named Priya sat cross-legged on her bunk reading something on a datapad, her dark hair tied back with a piece of wire. A broad-shouldered man named Orlov was doing slow push-ups on the floor with the focused, methodical calm of someone who had found that physical repetition was the only honest answer to helplessness. A teenager named Cassidy lay on her back staring at the ceiling with her arms stretched out, making a shape like a falling figure, perfectly still. None of them spoke. None of them had spoken much since the transport had lifted out of the transit hub 3 days ago. There wasn't a great deal to say. They had all been selected. The word selected was the hegemony's term, offered in the flat harmonic drone of the translation units, and it meant something different depending on where you stood. The hegemony considered it an honor. The humans had spent 3 days quietly deciding whether they agreed. Declan splashed water on his face. In the mirror above the basin, he looked at himself with the same dispassionate attention he brought to most things. He was 31 years old, medium height, lean in the way of someone who had grown up doing physical work before it was ever recreation. His face was angular, a little too serious, the kind of face that made people think he was angry when he was only thinking. He had a scar along the left jawline from a piece of shrapnel during the Kansai incident, though he never thought of it as a scar anymore, just the texture of his own face. His eyes were dark and steady, and gave away nothing he didn't intend to give. He was a combat trainer, had been before the selection. He had spent 6 years teaching close quarters fighting to UN peacekeeping contingents, adapting techniques, studying how bodies moved under stress, how the mind narrowed and simplified when the blood got loud. He was good at it, not because he was violent by nature, he wasn't, particularly, but because he was patient, and patient people understood violence better than anyone. The reason he was on the transport, he supposed, was that patience. The hegemony's Cohesion Initiative, their name for the program that had selected 44 humans from across the planet for what the translation units called martial arts exchange and cross-species cultural integration, was, stripped of its diplomatic language, a combat academy. A training facility on the hegemony station above Titan where human representatives would learn alien combat doctrine and demonstrate human techniques in return. Cultural exchange, mutual understanding, the civilized exchange of information about how to hurt each other. Declan had been told 3 separate times by 3 separate officials that it was not a competition. He had been in enough rooms to know what people said when they were lying by omission. The station was called Varanth, and it was enormous. Not enormous in the way that Earth's largest structures were enormous, the way a dam or a skyscraper was enormous, something you could hold in a frame and understand, but enormous in the way that made the frame irrelevant. It existed at a scale that didn't invite comparison. When their transport docked at the secondary human port, secondary, not primary, a distinction that no one mentioned but everyone absorbed, Declan stood at the viewport and looked out at the interior of the thing and felt a sensation he recognized from a handful of previous experiences. The sensation of being temporarily erased, of scale so large that the self became, for a moment, a rumor. He let the feeling happen. Then he picked up his bag and walked toward the disembarkation corridor. The Cohesion Academy occupied a section of Varanth that had been adapted, according to the briefing materials, to approximate conditions comfortable for multiple species simultaneously. This meant the gravity was slightly lighter than Earth standard. The lighting ran in cycles that were too long for human circadian rhythms, and the temperature was kept at a level that most of the humans found subtly wrong in a way they couldn't quite name, like standing in a room where the air conditioning had been running for 3 days straight. It also meant that, when Declan and his cohort were led into the main training hall for the first time, they found themselves sharing the space with beings from 4 other species he recognized, and at least 2 he didn't. The Keth were the dominant species in this wing of the hegemony. Declan had read the briefing materials twice on the transport. The Keth were bipedal, heavily built, with a dermal structure that functioned somewhere between skin and cartilage. Not armor exactly, but not soft tissue either. They were taller than humans by a significant margin, averaging just under 3 meters, and their anatomy included a second thoracic musculature group that gave them a reach and striking power that translated, in the briefing material's careful diplomatic language, as substantially exceeding human baseline in upper body force application. They had 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on a wide, flat face. They moved with a dense, unhurried weight that reminded Declan of the way a very large dog moved, confident in its mass, confident that nothing around it needed to move faster. Their instructor was named Vreth. Vreth was introduced to the human cohort by a hegemony liaison named something unpronounceable that the translation unit rendered as Coordinator Sil. Sil was a small, 4-limbed being with an expression that managed to communicate professional neutrality so thoroughly it had become a kind of message in itself. Sil explained, in the flat harmonic drone, that Vreth was among the most decorated combat instructors in the Keth Cohesion Corps, that his methodology was considered foundational across multiple species, and that the human cohort was fortunate to receive instruction of this caliber. Vreth looked at the humans the way a geologist looked at sedimentary rock, interested, mildly, patient, categorizing. He had them demonstrate their native movement patterns first. Not fighting movement, how they walked, how they stood, how they shifted weight. He walked slowly along the line of 44 humans, 4 eyes tracking each of them with a calm, systematic attention, and said nothing. Then he walked back. Then he said something in Keth, and Sil translated. Fragile, Sil said, but adaptive, we will see how adaptive. Declan said nothing. Priya, standing beside him, exhaled through her nose. The first week was assessment. Vreth, who never raised his voice, who communicated displeasure through density rather than volume, through stillness rather than motion, ran the humans through a standardized hegemony physical evaluation protocol. Strength, speed, flexibility, endurance, coordination. The protocol had clearly been designed for species with fundamentally different physical baselines, and the scores it generated for the humans were, in objective terms, unremarkable. Not terrible, just unremarkable. Average by a metric that had not been designed with them in mind. On the 4th day, Vreth introduced a session he called Foundational Combat Principles. He stood at the front of the hall with the unhurried gravity of something geological and explained, through Sil's translation, the fundamental theorem of Keth combat doctrine. It was, at its core, a simple idea. Force is primary. The combatant with greater mass, greater striking power, greater structural integrity wins. All other variables, speed, agility, technique, existed in service of this primary principle. Technique was a tool for delivering force. Agility was a method of positioning to apply force most efficiently. Intelligence was a way of identifying where force could be applied to maximum effect. He demonstrated. He asked for a volunteer from among the humans, and a man named Butchwold Large, a former Olympic wrestler, genuinely the most physically imposing human in the cohort, stepped forward. What followed was not unkind, but it was instructive. Butchwold lasted approximately 4 seconds in contact range before Vreth had him on the floor with the same matter-of-fact efficiency a carpenter might use to drive a nail. No flourish, no particular speed. Just the application of a force differential that was not small. Butchwold got up, rolled his shoulder experimentally, and went back to his place in the line. Force is primary, Vreth said through Sill. On the 5th day, Vreth announced the session parameters for the formal training program. Standardized hegemony training protocols. No improvisation. No deviation from established technique. No use of tools, weapons, or external implements. This was a study of the natural combatant, and therefore all sessions would be conducted without weapons or equipment of any kind. He looked at the humans when he said this, not maliciously, the way you looked at something that was clearly going to struggle. Declan filed the look away. He was, above all things, patient. Priya fell in beside him as they moved to the first drill stations. She had her datapad tucked under her arm. She was, Declan had learned over the past week, a sports biomechanist from Chennai who had spent the last 8 years studying human movement under extreme stress, and she had a habit of annotating everything she observed in neat, precise notes on the datapad. He thinks force is the only variable, she said quietly. He thinks it's the primary variable, Declan said. That's different. Is it? He said other variables exist in service of it. He said that's how it works in the framework he knows. He's not wrong about that framework. Priya looked at him sideways. You're going to do something, aren't you? Declan considered the question honestly. Eventually, he said. The training sessions fell into a rhythm. Mornings, physical conditioning under the Keth protocol. Afternoons, foundational technique drilling, always in the context of force primary doctrine. Evenings, theory sessions where Sill translated Vreth's lectures on hegemony combat philosophy. The human cohort was attentive, disciplined. They were good students, most of them, UN selected for a reason, screened for adaptability and emotional regulation, and the ability to function productively under stress. They learned the Keth techniques with genuine effort. They made real progress. But Vreth's evaluations were always the same. Technically acceptable, force insufficient, not a reproach so much as a fact, delivered with the calm of someone noting the weather. 3 weeks in, during an open sparring session, Vreth introduced what he called a demonstration of species-adapted parameters. He selected from the other cohort species present in the academy a representative of the Vorn's smaller beings, quick favored agility over mass, and had one of them spar against a Keth student. The Vorn moved beautifully. They were faster than the Keth by a significant margin, could slip angles, redirect force. They lasted, on average, 60% longer than the humans before being taken down. Vreth observed this. Vorn, he said through Sill, are an example of how speed, deployed intelligently, can partially compensate for a force deficit. They remain, ultimately, limited by the primary variable. But they demonstrate useful technique within that limitation. He looked at the humans. You are slower than the Vorn. You are weaker than the Keth. In the primary variable and its compensatory variables, you occupy the lowest position in this cohort. He said it without malice. He said it the way you said a measurement. Cassidy, the teenager, said something under her breath. Declan didn't hear it clearly, but Orlov, standing on the other side of her, almost smiled. That evening, Declan sat alone in the training hall after the others had gone to the dormitory wing. The lights were on their long cycle, dim and yellowish. the alien equivalent of late afternoon that came around every 18 hours. He moved through the hall slowly, not drilling, just moving. Thinking with his body, the way he'd always done when a problem needed solving. He was not, in that moment, thinking about how to beat a Keth in a straight engagement. That was not a problem he could solve with the variables available to him. Vreth was right about that. Force was primary in that equation, and the equation did not favor him. You didn't solve a physics problem by wishing the numbers were different. What he was thinking about was a different question. What was the human variable that had no hegemony framework for it? He moved through a sequence, not Keth technique, not any codified technique, just a series of connected movements he had developed over years of teaching, a kind of diagnostic language for how a body processed combat. He breathed. He thought. The thing about humans, the thing that had kept him employed for 6 years training other humans to fight, was not their strength, which was ordinary, or their speed, which was ordinary, or their endurance, which was actually somewhat above ordinary if you gave them time to adapt. The thing about humans was something harder to quantify, something in the relationship between creativity and catastrophe. The specific way that human beings, when they were genuinely cornered, when all the familiar options had been stripped away, when the situation became genuinely impossible, the specific way they didn't accept that. They adapted, not in the way that all species adapted, with evolutionary pressure over generations. They adapted in the moment, individually, mid-crisis, with the specific and somewhat alarming creativity of a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history in an environment that kept trying to kill it and had, generation after generation, found new ways to say not today. Declan thought about a short animated film he'd watched as a kid. He must have been 5 or 6, visiting his grandmother in Mexico City, and she'd had an old collection of classic shorts on a physical disc. One of them had been a cartoon mouse, small and slight by any standard, facing a monstrous creature twice his size. And the mouse had won, not because he was strong or fast or armored. He'd won because he refused to be categorized by the terms of the fight. He'd used the environment, the context, the specific physics of the situation. He'd been creative in a way that the monster simply wasn't, because the monster had force and didn't need to be creative. Declan stood still in the dim hall and looked at his hands. He realized, been thinking about this wrong. He'd been thinking about it as a problem of performance, how to perform better within Vreth's framework. But that wasn't the question. The question was what happened when a human being stopped trying to perform within someone else's framework and started doing what humans actually did, which was build their own. He went back to the dormitory and found Priya still awake, still working on her datapad. "I need to ask you something," he said. She looked up. "Okay. How much of what you've been writing down is Keth technique?" he said. "And how much is what you actually observe when the humans are fighting well?" She was quiet for a moment, then she turned the datapad toward him. The next morning, Declan asked Coordinator Sill for a meeting with Vreth. The meeting took place in the Instructor's review chamber, a small room off the main hall with a single wide table and chairs calibrated for Keth anthropometry, which meant Declan sat in a chair that was technically functional but made him feel like a child at a grown-up table. He had decided not to care about this. Vreth arrived precisely on time, settled into his chair with the fluid heaviness of his species, and looked at Declan across the table with calm, four-eyed attention. Declan said, through Sill, "I'd like to request a modification to the training protocol." Vreth's expression didn't change. Modification. "The current protocol prohibits improvisation and deviation from established technique. I'd like to request a session in which the humans demonstrate native combat approach alongside the Keth doctrine we've been learning. Not instead of alongside. A comparative demonstration." Vreth was quiet for a moment. The purpose of the Cohesion Initiative is to provide humans with hegemony standard combat training, not to evaluate native human methods. I understand that, Declan said. But cultural exchange, as I understand the initiative's stated purpose, goes in both directions. We've spent 3 weeks demonstrating our capacity to learn Keth technique. I'm asking for one session to demonstrate what we actually bring. Another silence. Vreth's 4 eyes moved in a fractional pattern that Declan had started to associate with something like consideration. One session, Vreth said finally. Unsanctioned, not part of formal protocol, my observation only. That's sufficient, Declan said. He spent the next 48 hours working with Priya and gradually with the rest of the cohort. He didn't teach them a new system. There wasn't time for that, and that wasn't the point anyway. What he did was have a series of conversations. He asked each of them, "What do you actually know?" Not what the protocol had asked them to demonstrate. What did they actually, physically, biologically know? The answers were remarkable. Butchwold, the wrestler, knew how to use leverage with a subtlety that the Force Primary framework had no category for, the precise application of joint mechanics to redirect mass rather than oppose it, a discipline that had taken centuries of human trial and error to develop. Priya knew movement biomechanics at a level that let her identify the precise moment in any sequence when a body was structurally committed and could not redirect. Orlov had spent 15 years studying Russian systema, a combat tradition built entirely around the idea that tension was the enemy of effective movement, that the human body fighting in a relaxed state moved in ways that a rigid opponent couldn't predict or counter. Cassidy, 17 years old, the youngest in the cohort, had grown up in her mother's taekwondo school and had a spatial awareness and kicking geometry that operated in planes the Keth anatomy simply didn't prioritize. And there were the others. A former fencer who understood distance management in 3 dimensions with the instinctive precision of someone who had spent a decade playing chess with a blade. A former firefighter who knew how to move through disorienting, chaotic environments while maintaining functional calm. A former ER surgeon who understood human anatomy at a level that let her identify structural vulnerabilities most fighters never thought about. A martial arts instructor from Jakarta who taught a system called Pencak Silat, a fluid, deceptive art built on the idea that the body in motion was always generating potential weapons from whatever happened to be attached to it. Declan sat with all of this and built something. Not a system, an approach, a way of being in a fight that drew on the specific human capacity to synthesize, to improvise, to look at a situation that seemed impossible and find the angle that hadn't been considered. He thought again about that cartoon mouse, about the moment in the fight where the monster had been so sure of its advantage that it had stopped paying attention to what the small thing in front of it was actually doing, about the smile on the mouse's face just before the situation changed. Not arrogance, just certainty. The certainty of someone who had decided that the game was going to be played differently, even if the other player hadn't been informed yet. On the 3rd morning, Vreth came to the training hall before the regular session. He stood at the edge of the mat with his arms crossed, a Keth resting posture, and watched as Declan arranged the cohort in a loose formation. He said nothing. Coordinator Sill stood 3 meters back, datapad in hand, expression professionally neutral. Declan turned to face his cohort. He looked at them, 43 people from 22 countries who had been selected, assessed, measured, and found insufficient according to a framework that had never been built with them in mind, and who had spent 3 weeks learning that framework anyway, without complaint, without excuses, because that was what you did when you were trying to understand something. He felt something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite love, but occupied the same general territory. No adjustments, he said. No planning. Whatever the situation gives you, use it, everything you know. He looked at Butchwold. Butchwold nodded. He looked at Priya. She folded her datapad under her arm and rolled her neck. He looked at Cassidy. Cassidy grinned, the particular grin of someone who had been told they weren't good enough at something and had been saving up their response. "Okay," Declan said. What followed was not a performance. That was the first thing Vreth registered. It was not staged, not choreographed, not a demonstration in the way that demonstrations usually were. The humans began moving, and the movement was alive in a way that the Keth doctrine sessions had never been, alive with the specific quality of something that had been compressed for a long time and was now allowed to be its actual shape. Butchwold took the first engagement. The Keth student he was matched against was larger, heavier, and moved with absolute confidence. The engagement lasted 11 seconds. At the end of those 11 seconds, the Keth student was on the mat, placed there by a sequence of weight transfers and joint redirections that had involved, at no point, any direct opposition of force. Butchwold hadn't tried to overpower him. He had moved with him, used the very certainty of the Keth's force application as the lever, found the moment of structural commitment, and simply made gravity do the rest. He stood back and looked at the Keth student with the expression of someone who had just demonstrated a mathematical proof. The Keth student stood up slowly. He looked at Butchwold with the four-eyed consideration of someone recategorizing information. Priya worked differently. She fought the way a scientist ran an experiment: hypothesis, test, observation, adjustment, new hypothesis. She lost the first exchange, cleanly and without complaint, and then she adjusted, and then she won the second, and then she adjusted again, and the third exchange was something qualitatively different, a fluid, reading conversation between two bodies in motion where she was always 2 movements ahead of where her opponent expected her to be. She didn't have superior force. She had superior information, gathered and processed in real time, and she used it with the cold precision of someone who had spent a decade studying exactly this. Orlev moved like smoke. The system of principles he applied were, from the outside, almost invisible, not because he was fast, but because tension was so thoroughly absent from everything he did that the Keth responses calibrated to a threat that wasn't presenting as a threat found nothing to lock onto. He absorbed force and redirected it. He moved with the kind of fluid indirection that left his opponents consistently hitting where he had just been. He looked, Declan thought, like water dealing with a fist. The fist kept hitting water, the water kept being fine. Cassidy was something else entirely. She fought in the vertical dimension with a geometry that the Keth simply hadn't trained for, because the Keth relied on their mass and their structural solidity, and neither of those things were relevant when the attack was coming from an angle that their anatomy didn't naturally defend. She was quick and small, and she moved in arcs, and her expression throughout was the expression of someone playing a game they'd been waiting to play for a long time. Vreth stood at the edge of the mat and watched all of this. He didn't speak for a long time. He stood with the patient weight of his species and watched the humans move and fight and lose and adapt and fight again differently, and his 4 eyes tracked the patterns with the attention of someone who was recalibrating something fundamental. When it was over, when the session had run its natural course, and the humans stood scattered across the mat breathing hard and flushed and quiet, Vreth walked out onto the floor. He looked at Declan. Declan met his gaze and waited. "You used no weapons," Vreth said through Sill. "No," Declan said. "The session parameter specified no weapons. You complied." "Yes." A pause. "Your force is still insufficient by primary variable metrics." "Agreed." And yet the engagement outcomes deviated significantly from projected parameters. Declan said nothing. Vreth's 4 eyes did the fractional motion that Declan now associated with thought. Explain the mechanism. Declan considered how to answer this honestly. He looked at his hands for a moment. He thought about the cartoon mouse, about his grandmother's apartment, about the smell of the city coming through the open window, while he sat on the floor watching an ancient animated film about a small creature that refused to accept the terms it had been given. "We don't fight force with force," he said. "We fight force with every other variable simultaneously. We read the situation, we adapt to it, we use what's available. Not because we're smart, though we're reasonably smart, but because we grew up in an environment that would have killed us if we stopped doing that. We're not born with armor or claws or mass or speed that outcompetes our predators. What we're born with is the capacity to look at a situation that's stacked against us and find the angle that wasn't in the original calculation." He paused. "The instructor said no weapons in combat," he said. "I was born with them. Every human in this room was. They're not physical, they're cognitive, and they don't show up in the primary variable assessment because the primary variable assessment doesn't have a category for them." Sill's translation drone finished. Vreth stood still. Then something happened in the geometry of his face. Not a smile. His species didn't smile, but a reorganization of his expression into something that carried the weight of reassessment, of something being moved from one category to another. "Demonstrate again," Vreth said. "This time I will observe the mechanism directly." They demonstrated again, and again. Over the following days, something in the sessions shifted, not dramatically, not in any way that changed the formal protocol or the hegemony's assessment framework, but in the specific texture of Vreth's attention. He watched the humans differently. He began, in the theory sessions, to ask questions that hadn't been in the lecture material. What is the cognitive process during the adaptation moment? How does the species maintain functional decision-making under sustained physical stress? Is the improvisation capacity trainable or innate? Priya answered most of these questions with the precision of someone who had been thinking about exactly this for a decade. Declan began to suspect that what they were doing, without intending to, was introducing into a combat doctrine built on force primacy, something that force primacy had never accounted for. The variable that didn't compete with force, that didn't try to exceed force, that simply made force beside the point. 3 weeks later, the formal evaluation session came. The one that the cohort had understood from the beginning was the actual purpose of the initiative, the assessment that would determine how humans were categorized in the hegemony's database of combat-capable species. The one that was, formally, not a competition. The other species cohorts went first. The Vorn scored as expected, fast, agile, strong within their scale, limited by the primary variable assessment. The others performed competently, each within predictable parameters. The evaluators, 3 Keth officials who sat at a long table with the patient gravity of their species, noted everything, commented on little, moved to the next. Then the humans. Butchwold was first. The evaluator who faced him was not pulling punches. These were formal evaluations, and formal evaluations were conducted at real intensity. The evaluator came in with the full force of the Keth primary doctrine and found over 63 seconds that it kept encountering something it hadn't planned for. Not resistance, redirection, not opposition, dissolution. The evaluator was larger, heavier, and stronger, and none of those things were helping him, and that was visible in the changing quality of his attention as the seconds passed. Priya was second. She lost the first 30 seconds cleanly and without apparent concern, observing, categorizing, building the model, and then she didn't lose any more. Orlov was third. He moved like smoke and looked bored, which was unfair to his opponent, but Water didn't have a great deal of sympathy for the fist. Cassidy was fourth. The evaluator assigned to her was large even by Keth standards, and he came at her with the confidence of something that had never had a reason not to be confident. He hit the first problem at 8 seconds, when a kick that had no business being at that angle connected with a target his anatomy had never been trained to defend. He recalibrated. He hit the second problem at 14 seconds. He recalibrated again. At 27 seconds, Cassidy had him moving reactively, which was where she wanted him, and at 34 seconds she had him on the mat, and she stood over him with her hands on her knees, catching her breath, her hair in her face, grinning the grin of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment for a very long time. She offered him a hand up. He looked at the hand for a moment, then he took it. The three evaluators at the long table were quiet for a time that felt significant. Then the senior evaluator, a Keth of considerable age, whose dermal structure had the worn, settled quality of old stone, said something that Syl translated with the careful precision of someone who wanted to get the nuance right. The human cohort has demonstrated combat capability in a category for which the current evaluation framework has no existing classification. We are noting this in the formal record as requiring the development of new assessment parameters. A pause. We are also noting that the cognitive improvisation variable, as demonstrated, constitutes a combat capacity that does not diminish under force primary pressure, and in certain engagement configurations may constitute a tactical advantage that exceeds conventional force equivalency. Another pause. This is not an outcome we anticipated. Declan stood with his cohort and listened to the translation and looked at the long table and thought about what to say. He thought about the cartoon mouse. He thought about his grandmother in her apartment in Mexico City. He thought about his father, the machinist, who had spent his whole life looking at broken things and finding ways to make them work again, and who had never, not once, concluded that a problem couldn't be solved because the solution wasn't obvious. He thought about 44 people from 22 countries who had been told, repeatedly and in the calm, assessing language of measurement, that they were insufficient, and who had listened politely and then gone ahead and done what they did. He didn't say any of this. He didn't say anything, because this wasn't a moment for speeches. It was a moment for letting what had just happened sit in the room and do its own work. Vreth was standing off to the side. He met Declan's eyes, 4 of his to 2 of Declan's, and held them for a moment. Then he gave a minimal nod, not a bow, not a concession, an acknowledgement one combatant to another that something real had been seen. Declan nodded back. The dormitory that evening was different from the previous evenings. Not loud, nobody was celebrating in any conspicuous way, but the quality of the silence had changed. It had the particular warmth of shared understanding, of people who had been through something together and didn't need to summarize it. Priya was working on her datapad again, but she was smiling. Orlov was doing push-ups, but more slowly than usual, the kind of slowness that was actually satisfaction. Cassidy was lying on her back with her arms stretched out, making the same falling figure shape she'd made every evening since they arrived, but her face was turned toward the ceiling with an expression that was not helplessness, but something closer to ownership, as if she were looking at a ceiling that she had, in some meaningful sense, earned. Declan sat on the edge of his bunk and held his own hands together and felt his heartbeat, and counted 5 beats and thought about everything. He thought about how you didn't beat a force primary system by being stronger. You beat it by being something the system didn't have a category for, by arriving with a variable the equation hadn't considered, by doing what humans did, which was look at the way things were arranged and find the arrangement that nobody else had thought of. He thought about the universe outside the station and how large it was, and how many species were out there with frameworks built on force, on mass, on the primary variables, all of them confident in their mathematics. He thought about how little any of them had planned for a species that had spent its whole history getting the math wrong and refusing to notice. On the 4th day after the evaluation, Vreth came to the morning session with something new in his schedule. He asked Declan and Priya to stand at the front of the room. He asked them to demonstrate the adaptation mechanism, the cognitive process, the whole framework that had no name in the hegemony's combat doctrine vocabulary. Then he turned to the rest of his roster, Keth students, Vorn students, two other species Declan still hadn't properly identified, and he said, through Sill's translation, "Observe. This is something you have not seen before. Pay attention to the variable, not the force, the variable." And the room watched. Declan met Priya's eyes. She raised an eyebrow, the slight, precise motion of someone who had measured something and found it exactly where they expected. He turned to the room. He thought, a small cartoon mouse, in an apartment in Mexico City, winning a fight nobody thought he could win. He thought, this is what we brought. And he began. The weeks that followed had a different quality than the weeks before. The formal curriculum continued, the Keth doctrine, the force primary framework, the protocol sessions. But alongside it, running parallel like a second track, there was something new. Questions from Keth students who had watched the evaluation and wanted to understand the mechanism. Requests for joint sessions where human and Keth techniques could be compared directly, not competitively but analytically. A growing interest, careful and systematic, in the thing that the assessment framework didn't have a category for. Vreth ran these sessions with the same focused attention he brought to everything. He never called it an innovation. He called it a data point requiring extended study. Declan found, to his own mild surprise, that he enjoyed the extended study. Teaching always did that to him, the specific pleasure of watching understanding move from one person to another, of seeing someone's posture change when they stopped fighting a concept and started working with it. The Keth students were serious and precise and genuinely curious, and those were qualities he respected in anyone. One evening near the end of the 7th week, after most of the others had left the hall, Vreth stopped beside Declan while he was collecting equipment. He was quiet for a moment, which was not unusual. Then he said, through the translation unit on his wrist, "The assessment framework will be revised." Declan said nothing. The cognitive variable will be added as a primary category, not secondary, not compensatory, primary alongside force. Still nothing from Declan. He looked at the equipment in his hands. "This is because of what was demonstrated here," Vreth said. "The data is unambiguous." Declan set the equipment down carefully. He thought about the right thing to say. He thought about what his father would have said in that situation, his father who fixed things, who looked at broken systems and found what the original designers had missed. "The data was always there," Declan said. "We just needed a context to show it." Vreth's 4 eyes held him with the steady, geological attention that was the Keth version of respect. "That may be accurate," he said. He picked up the equipment case and walked toward the storage room, unhurried, with the settled certainty of something that had recalibrated and found its footing on new ground. Declan watched him go. Then he looked down at his hands, plain human hands, nothing particularly remarkable about them, calloused in the places you got calluses from working, shaped by the ordinary pressures of an ordinary life on a middling planet orbiting an unremarkable star. He thought about what was born into them, not in the sense of genetics, not in the sense of anything you could measure on a primary variable assessment, in the sense of everything that had been handed down through every generation that had ever looked at an impossible situation and thought, not yet, not today. Let's try this differently. He made a fist, opened it. Then he picked up his bag and walked toward the dormitory, thinking about nothing in particular, a man in a room at the edge of the species' future, going to get some sleep.